Thank you, everyone. It was important for me to bring Alexandre Caseroni to give us a broad landscape of the history of cultural development, of cultural politics in the Gulf region, broadly defined, in what will be a continuing conversation with Felwine Sarr. Both Alexandre and Felwine will contribute to the catalogs, as will most of the speakers from the talk series. It was important for me also, in contrast with, to bring back to the fore the development of museums in the region, in contrast with biennials such as the Sharjah Biennial, which offers a vastly different model of exhibition making than would a museum context, if you will. This also on the heel of one of the performances which led us here, which is Meshach Gaba's Défilé de Perruques Architecture. Meshach did not select Le Louvre Abu Dhabi as one of the new worthy buildings of the region, but he might as well have. But Meshach is important not solely because of the way in which he recirculates objects, much along what Felwine advocates, but also because Meshach is one who we know as the founder of the so-called Museum of Contemporary African Art, which dates back to maybe already a decade ago, but which, as we know, was one of the first example of a contemporary artist of an African contemporary artist thinking about museology, thinking about not just how his or her work would be cited within the hegemonic site of display, but how it could create a space of its own. So I'm interested in the way in which an artist like Meshach is already, taking us away from the traditional exhibitionary complex, if you will. It's also significant for me that we will be having this conversation here, for I pointed out to you that we were near the site where Leo Acemota's work is presented. Leo Acemota is one who, much like Felwine, rather than lingering on the debate around restitutions, prefers instead, in his case, to show the way in which the rituals of the Kingdom of Benin, Benin City, Nigeria, far from having been interrupted entirely by the sack of the kingdom by the British in 1897, have survived and are being revived by the current Oba. So he is already, by employing some of the key materials of these rituals, be they coral or kaolin or vellum, he's already recirculating meaning through objects. And I think that the role of object as mediator is very important in the way in which we can begin to rethink exhibitionary practices. I like to think that artists, of course, do their work by embedding it oftentimes with anti-hegemonic discourses, but I find that sometimes curators fall short where at the end of the day such work ends up being cited within the very hegemonic spaces which they in fact seek to critique. So I will simply complete this brief summary by saying that, of course, another great metaphor from Felwine's talk was that of Kader Attia's phantom limb, and to refer back to Adrian Edwards' talk from earlier this morning in Bait Obaid Al Shamsi, who reminded us of the handy notion of errancy. Maybe these errant limbs, the many dispersed artifacts that are set on the road or out of context and off-sites as part of Look For Me All Around You, can contribute to reform a social body that encompasses all these different global and diasporic strands. Now, how are you all doing? Are you happy to continue forward, or would you like to take a break? We have 2 more presentations. that are going to take us further into the discourse or the debate around museology, and especially how more sustainable museology can be and museum building. So the next two speakers are Imani Brown and Philip Ram, who will be introduced by Diego. Imani Brown is not with us, but she has given us a video which we will screen. And the reason why Imani is not here is because as an American scholar based in Louisiana, which is the space from which she will speak of the relationship between oil, money, and arts funding, having recently relocated to Europe, she is discovering the wonderful train system that from London allows her to travel and to do away with plane travel. So as an eco-activist, she's decided to reduce her carbon footprint and has desisted from taking the plane from London to Dubai to be here with us. So therefore, her presentation is fully in keeping with her ethics as an ecologically conscious activist. You want to introduce Imani? Yes, thank you. And following Imani will be Philip Ram. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Claire. As Claire has made a brief summary of what we heard, Imani will dig into the relation between oil money and arts funding. And it's an interesting line to open in relation to, as she referred, how artists' discourses tend to be criticizes to hegemonic forces, hegemonic violence, hegemonic extractivism, hegemonic ways and structures of articulating and controlling the word. And once those objects are exhibited in a museum, those discourses are sterilized. So once we find ourselves in this paradox of criticism being totally neutralized by the same institution that is found by oil, Imani's video will trace a very critical understanding of our own relationship as an art global community to these institutions. So no further word, let's see Imani's video.
Artist, alongside a tank representing, quote, "In the beginning there was oil. The story of the Gulf would be incomplete without it. So begins an origin story that many transnational oil companies would like Gulf communities around the world to put their faith in. This particular writing on the wall can be found in the New Orleans Audubon Aquarium, named for John James Audubon, a famed naturalist artist, alongside a tank representing, quote, the Gulf of Mexico, supported by BP, Shell, Chevron, ExxonMobil, Tenneco, Carnegie, and the estate of Mr. William A. Hess, end quote. Within, endangered sea turtles circumnavigate a scaled replica of an oil rig. This year's Sharjah Biennial implores us to look for me all around you, seeing who and what lies hidden in plain sight. The weeping scars of extraction are all around us, are within us, and are within our cultural institutions. They are hidden not because of their invisibility, but because within global capitalist civilization, extractivism has won the status of imminence. And because we have largely failed to cultivate the ability, despite the prominence of vision in our modern sensorial hierarchy, to see what we have allowed ourselves to become. From a suspended distance, as far from my home in the extractive zone of the U.S. state of Louisiana, as from the extractive zone of Fujairah, UAE, I am exploring ways of seeing through unraveling the snarl of invasive infrastructure, corporate philanthropy, and propaganda, dissecting and dismantling it. Our horizons are only constricted by the myopia of our visions. Art museums could be considered as instruments for remote sensing. Through them, one can communicate across space, time, language, and culture. They also communicate via the politics they enact through labor practices and the logos on their walls, with those human and non-human communities that are sacrificed for their construction and maintenance. With the right lenses, the visitor to the Contemporary Art Museum can see through the logos and names engraved in marble walls to the global extractive zones and people with whom you are now unexpectedly and unavoidably in dialogue. Wetlands are spaces of imminent creation. They are among the world's most productive ecosystems, offering fertile breeding grounds, natural water purification, and coastal erosion protection for nearly half of the world's species of threatened and protected plants and animals. It is a great geologic irony that the ecosystems that fertilize the rise of human civilization have also given us oil, the tool to effect our downfall. The Garden of Eden, believed to be located in the fertile grounds between the Tigris and Euphrates in modern Iraq, was a wetland. More recently, it has been the site of oil extraction, ecocide, and conquest of the region's indigenous inhabitants. From the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman, to the Gulf of Guinea, to the Gulf of Mexico, coastal wetlands have been drained, dredged, and canalized from cradles of civilization to depleted sites of contestation and conflict, hazardscapes inhabited by sacrificed populations. The geophysical process of oil production alters deltaic morphology, hydrology, and biodiversity, and toxifies environments. Its political production steals self-determination from local populations, decimates cultural ecologies, imposes two-tier economic systems based on precarious, hazardous, and racialized labor for the many, produces extraordinary wealth for the few, and violently represses those who dare to resist. BP, Shell, and Chevron are among the oil companies historically and presently disproportionately responsible for sacking the soils of civilization. Today, they give back by sponsoring exhibitions of stolen artifacts to delight the senses of colonial citizens. Wetlands are the victims, but also the enemies of the corporate state. Politicians long preceding Trump have issued calls to drain the swamp as part of their modernist vision of mastery, expansion, and clarity. The modern state is unnerved by the wetland's carefree fluidity, identifying as water one day, 1 year, 1 moment, and land the next. And as the fractal folds of the delta nurture biodiversity, so do these irrational landscapes provide shelter to fugitives of extractive violence. In the Americas, African and indigenous Maroons made their escape in their homes in swamps. Wetlands subvert capitalist speculation and risk management. In Louisiana, as oil exploitation ravages coastal wetlands along with human and non-human communities, $100 billion of oil infrastructure will also become submerged in open water. Wetlands will take this whole ship down with them. They are the true counterculture. In the 18th century, the concept of vacuum domicilium rationalized the theft of indigenous land in America, declaring it as empty and disappearing its inhabitants. Vacuum domicilium was one of many Enlightenment theories used to justify the eradication and exploitation of a great part of the world's bouquet of cultures, species, and ecosystems. Its theorists hoarded objects, animals, and even people in cabinets of curiosity for contemplative study. Thus was born the modern museum. The fossil fuel industry inherited the enlightened culture of disappearance, as well as the racialized, spatial, economic, and environmental logics of colonialism and slavery. For 7,000 years, the hurricane, the river, and the flood worked together to form the land now called Louisiana. The land's deformation by dissonant development has been achieved broadly in 3 centuries, acutely in 80 years. 300 years ago, French colonists discovered Bulbancha, meaning land of many languages in a regional indigenous trade language, and had a vision: New Orleans, the economic and logistics seat of empire in the marshlands of the Mississippi River Delta. The vision was realized, albeit by a different colonial power, the United States, by attempting mastery of the Delta with a system of levees and pumps, establishing the largest slave market in North America, and exploiting the region's oil riches. After emancipation, all black towns formed alongside riverside plantations as former slaves remained bound as sharecroppers. After the discovery of oil at the turn of the 20th century, the fossil fuel industry took over occupation of Louisiana's lands, placing some of the nation's most polluting industry on the bitter grounds of modernist industrial plantations. Today, the region is known as Cancer Alley. Further downriver, the oil industry has dredged 10,000 miles of canals to access over 50,000 oil and gas wells throughout Louisiana's wetlands. Forming a fraying latticework of uncoordinated and largely abandoned throughways, access canals usher salt water from the Gulf into freshwater wetlands, precipitating widespread vegetation death and sediment erosion. As bodies of water, access canals are easily naturalized, yet revealing their Cartesian lines and the wells that anchor their angles exposes them as man-made infrastructure as machinic as pipelines, oil platforms, and refineries. These are the great works of an extractive culture. In Louisiana, 2,000 square miles of wetland, a critical buffer for coastal communities from destructive hurricanes like Katrina, have disappeared along with several towns. The fossil fuel industry's invasive infrastructure has gone feral. Like oil access canals, fossil fuel logos are deceptively naturalized machinic widgets, apparata of extractive infrastructure that are essential to the smooth functioning of industry. Inscribed in the walls of civic institutions, fossil fuel logos represent the signature on an unwritten contractual agreement, known in industry speak as a social license to operate. According to BP Vice President Dev Sanyal, the social license indicates that, quote, society has sanctioned the actions of the company, trusting that the benefits of its operations outweigh the costs, end quote. Yet how do we comprehend and quantify who, what, and where is sacrificed and disappeared as the cost of doing business? According to Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, the world's largest asset management fund and biggest economic superpower, contemporary art and luxury real estate have surpassed gold as the greatest instruments for the storage and investment of wealth. The Contemporary Art Museum is thus a gold mine, a bank, and a PR machine for extractive capitalism. As social license, art is not a soft power. It is the membrane surrounding hard power, holding together the machinic muscles that mobilize displacement, dispossession, military intervention, and annihilation. Corporate logos shift the public gaze onto fashionable museums and away from their company's signature public program, civilizational collapse. The cultural space of international museums is suspended in an elongated state change, neither here nor there. It hovers between a dying culture that we must put to rest and a future culture we cannot yet see for the logos in our eyes. In this way, I am reminded of wetlands where death gives birth to life, which becomes death in murky and imminent cycles, where the liquefied bones of dead matter steer humanity to the stars, where we discover not our maker nor our future, but our immortality, back on Earth, back in the muddy, ambiguous, ambivalent Earth we sought for centuries to escape, mistaking elevation for dignity. The art world understands that the juxtaposition of two works puts them in dialogue with one another. Surely we can see that these logos are so placed in order to speak through art. Art becomes a magnificent death mask donned by transnational oil companies. Creation, sponsored by death. Global capitalist culture has contorted people, land, ideas, and life itself into instruments for speculative investment and objects of extraction, into means to an end. The role of art is to ask, to what end? Yet in the oil-funded cultural institution, the question is already encoded within its own answer. There is no point in questioning the end, for there is no escape, and there is no alternative. The climate crisis is, at its core, a cultural crisis. Look for fragments of fossil fuel infrastructure all around you. See the industry's logos in your beloved museums as symbolic representations of environmental crimes against humanity committed against the disappeared peoples in Nigeria, Iraq, or Louisiana. Recognize them as nodes of potential solidarity with the human and non-human peripheries that are already at the center of your world. Consider their removal as the defense of civilization from an industry that would be happy to auction its ruins, and know that their disappearance will free our visionaries to truly prefigure a world beyond petroleum. Museums may collect humanity's precious cultural artifacts, but they cannot store the ecosystems vital to humanity's existence in their vaults. They cannot archive the land, the villages, the flora and fauna, the people who have already been lost to rising seas. What can cultural institutions do in the face of such loss? They can declare their independence and reassess their values, transforming from archives of old worlds into incubators that give birth to new ones. Some cultural institutions are slowly dismantling the temporary Enlightenment walls separating art from life. But many more cultivate inertia by clinging to the sponsors they share with the end of the world. We are bound to this world, and in it, we are bound to each other. We need our institutions to do more than to take stock of what we will lose. We need them to defend what we have left. In the beginning there was oil. The story of the Gulf would